Hi there, I'm Mark, and welcome to Book Ramble. And this is the third attempt to do this because I'm useless. At my introduction to BookTube, said that I've got 9 or 10 books on the go. And believe me, there's more than that at the moment because I put a few more that I'm going through, such as this. Oh, wow. And this one. This is Don Quixote, which is a large work that has been condensed in such a small book. So much so that the paper is really thin. And I don't think you're going to pick up on the camera here, but often the words from the other page come through. It's a lovely book. But how is it that I can have 9 or 10 books on the go and then read 3 or 4 pages, and when I come back 9 or 10 books away, that I can remember what I've read? So, trigger warning, because I know some people don't like people writing or annotating in books, but I do. So why do I do that? Well, I learnt it at uni. If you go to uni, of course, not everybody has been to uni, which is something that shocked me when I went. That I went to the library, got some books that was on the reading list of whatever topic, and you could tell previously it had been written because there were notes everywhere. Actually helped because it highlighted where you should be reading. But having prior to that always had books, I had this kind of, oh, you shouldn't write in them. But I've got used to that. And as a teacher, of course, it's a way of making notes before you go into a lesson and so on. So I'm not sure on the worth of this because this is just the way I do it. But I thought I'd put out there that this is the method I do to remind myself of what I have just read previously. So Don Quixote, I have got in my previous reading up until chapter 2, coming into chapter 2. So before I start reading again, I'll just go through over the highlights. And I'm just going to read out to you what I've highlighted. And then you can be a judge as to whether, oh, yeah, okay, this will refix in your mind if it was you reading it and then before you moved on. So his diet consumed 3/4 of his revenue. Nigh 50 years of age, lean-bodied and thin-faced. That's what I've just put on. Just that. Doesn't take long to read. I'll go on to the next page, just to remind myself, if I needed to. He passed his time in reading books. He grew so strangely enamoured of these amusements that he sold many acres of land to purchase books. I've also written down here a critique of literature. It goes on to the next page. Because this is obviously Cervantes who's writing this, the author. And he gives an example of the bizarre language that you do get in typical medieval or pre-Renaissance Romance-style literature. And in quotes, he's got an example of a bit tortuous language. The reason of your unreasonable usage of my reason does so enfeeble my reason that I have reason to expostulate. Yeah, I'll start this one again. The reason of your unreasonable usage of my reason does so enfeeble my reason that I have reason to expostulate with your beauty. Basically, it's poking fun at the way that some books of his time were written. And then I continue that by sleeping little and reading much, he at last lost his reason. This is Don Quixote. A world of extraordinary notions, picked out of his books, crowded into his imagination. Thus confused, he unluckily stumbled upon the oddest fancy that ever entered into a madman's brain, to turn knight-errant and roam through the whole world in quest of adventures, imitating those knights-errant of whom he had read. And then he talks about his horse, that it's just basically a bag of bones. He calls it Rosinante. And then he's determined to give himself a name, Don Quixote de la Mancha. And like a knight-errant, he must have a woman, who he calls Dulcinea. and then I'm on to chapter 2. So really, all this does is just sets up into my memory before I carry on and read the next couple of 3 pages. But when I come back, I wouldn't go to the very beginning again, because hopefully by then it's already fixed in my mind. That's how I do it. And it just, by the time I get to the end, there'll be a whole lot of colour in this book. And then, therefore, very easy to pick out various things. But rather than repeat stuff that I'd already done at the beginning, it may have whole sections of which there'll be look like there's no notes. So that's Don Quixote. And what's interesting about this particular book, and why I'm really interested to read it, is because it's one of those examples of books in the past that I read and stalled halfway through. And I thought, I've got to get to grips with such of these books. And I've had comments and back and forth with people on their posts or my posts. And we've been talking about Dune. So great books, big ideas. We've been talking about Dune. And that's a book that I have struggled in the past to read. For various reasons. So I need to really get back into it and start making notes potentially. Don Quixote is interesting as a book because the author, I believe, was a prisoner of the Barbary Corsairs. He'd been taken, I think he was probably at sea, and ended up in difficult circumstances, in which he eventually got his release. Not uncommon, the Sally pirates, or the Barbary Corsairs, would often exchange prisoners in line of not molesting a nation's shipping going through the Mediterranean, or possibly getting cannon and muskets in return. In fact, there was this thing called the Pass, the Mediterranean Pass, which Britain certainly did from about the 1680s onwards to give safe passage for their shipping. They would pay a lot of money to the Corsairs and have this piece of paper that would be serrated and then almost cut in half. And one half would go to the people in charge of ports or in charge of fleets in modern-day Morocco and whatever. And then the ship's captain going through that part of the sea would have the top half, and if ever boarded by a corsair, they would have packets in which they just check to see if they actually matched, and therefore if they did, it was like a passport. Cervantes eventually got away from that part of the world, and then I think began writing in Spanish or Castilian this book, and it's been a perennial favourite ever since with the Spanish-speaking world. I just sense that a lot of it would lose the power of the language because it's translated into English, but it's still, what I remember, a good read. My challenge is to read it all the way through, and making these notes helps. I think it breaks down this wall that I may have in my head unfairly, and it just makes the wall crumble in my mind. I guess that's the reason why I do it. I'm not saying it's going to work for you. It works for me. So anyway, Don Quixote is one that's currently on the go, and I'll read a bit more, do an episode of it later on. Thanks for listening.